Hi everyone. In this video, we're going to create the code system that I mentioned in the previous video for the first observation profile example. So what we're going to walk through together is first make sure that the IG setup on your machine from an earlier video is still working. I'll show you how to get started with that if you haven't watched that or walked through it. I'll show how to add some extra logging information and look at that output because it's useful to know what the publisher assumes about your directories. And then we'll create a custom directory in addition to the default directories that the publisher uses. And we'll name it observation-ks to contain all the files that we're going to create for this first profiling example. It's easier to see them in one folder because content will increase gradually in that repository. And then I'll create the code system for the characteristic 6 example that I mentioned in the last video. Okay, so if you have not watched the previous video for getting set up for the IG publisher, you could watch that video here. And these slides will be linked in the description, so you could follow through these links to find that video. If you don't want to watch a video, you could also check out the GitHub repository, check out this branch. So if you go to the GitHub repository here, make sure you are on the FHIR IG demo initial setup branch. This branch has the content as it was shown in the video with some minor fixes. The README might have kind of been updated. The README that you want to look at is in this IG root folder. Sorry, actually, it's in the FHIR IG demo folder. There is a README here that has all the steps that were done in the initial setup video. And there's some links here, useful links. But this checkout, if you check it out, and you also grab the jar file that you need, the tool, from this link. So if you go here and grab the jar file here and save it in the IG root directory in your checkout. And then in the IG root directory, if you run the command java-jar publisher, if you put a version number under along with the name, by default it's publisher.jar, but if you've added a version number to it, and then -ig space ig.ini, and you want to run that in the IG root folder. And if everything goes well and you have an output that sort of ends with like what you see here in the screenshot, let me wait for this hover to disappear. Sorry, let me go back one slide. Okay. So if the output looks like this, it says build final zip, and then everything is back. It's okay to get an error or warnings. That's not a problem. If you see this output, then you're fine. Your setup is working. Okay, so that's the first step. The next step, I'm going to increase the publisher logging, and we'll see these actually live, but I want to walk through the slides first. So for additional logging, go to this wiki page. And if you click on it, it will take you to a table of parameters that you could configure in the ig.json file. We're going to use this parameter and create an entry for this parameter and set its value to init. And so here, let me go back. I need to stop clicking on these slides. Okay, so I'm going to add the logging parameter and set its value to init, and in the ig.json file. And if you run the publisher again, you'll see some additional output early on in the build. And I have a screenshot of it here. You could see that it shows you the source of directories that the tool uses. So let's see if can I hide this? Anyway, So you have the source directories that it looks for. There are pages directories, and there's the temporary directory, an output directory, and a QA directory. And if you follow through here, you see the IG root input. The input is the source, the parent source directory, and you could see that by default, the publisher looks for directories that are called capability, examples, extensions, models, profiles, resources, vocabulary, and so forth. And if you remember, I mentioned that you need to create at least one of these directories. In the video, I created the resources directory just so the publisher at least finds one directory out of this list that it looks through. And you could put your content in these directories based on the type of content. The idea is that you put your profiles in profiles folder, resources, like instances of FHIR resources in here, vocabulary content in here. But I'm going to add another folder to this list just for this first observation profile example. Okay, so I'll show how to do that. So that's step 3. I'm going to create a folder called observation.ks just for that first profiling example. And again, if you go to the IG publisher documentation, one of the wiki pages for the documentation, you can see there's a parameter called path resources. So you could create as many parameter entries for the paths that the publisher will look at. And you want to add a relative path here to tell the publisher where to look. So for this example, I'm going to add that parameter, and then I'm going to add this relative path. The relative path starts with the input folder, and then you put a slash, and then put your custom folder that you're adding, that you want the publisher to look inside to find things that you are referring to. There, in addition to the wiki page that I showed here, the FHIR specification itself has a value set. Okay, so I'm going to show that. It has a value set that lists the standard specification parameters, and path resource is one of them, and you could read the description of these parameters. These are considered the specification specified parameters. The wiki page has additional parameters that also are implementation specific to the IG publisher. So if you're using the IG publisher, you can use some of these parameters. For example, the logging parameter is an implementation parameter, and you don't find it in the specification parameters. And if you use any of these implementation parameters and you have JSON schema supports, you'll see it be flagged as an error. You don't need to worry about that. That's fine. And I'll show this in a second. Okay, so if you add this parameter configuration and you run the publisher again, you'll see that the folder that you just added gets listed. And I think the folders get listed in the order that you specify them in the ig.json file. And the ones you specify there come before the default ones. And I'm showing you here a little bit that this is the first folder that it's looking for, and then it's going on to look through the other folders. Okay, so before we start creating the code system, let me just show you how these things look like. It's really simple. So in the previous setup, I showed that these two parameters, release label and copyright year, two parameters were needed for the publisher to run. So we had these already in there. But I've added to the parameter. So this is, let me step back a little bit. So we are in the IG root folder. In the input folder, there is the ig.json file. And the IG, if you remember, the ig.json file is an instance of the implementation guide FHIR resource. And we had this filled in last time. All I'm adding are these two parameter entries right here. So you put a comma and you put another JSON object, which stands for the parameter, and another one. So this is a logging init, and this is a path resource, and that's the extra file. And if you look at it here, you'll see the output. So on the loading, so on the loading phase of the publisher, it determines the root directory, and the root directory is the directory that has the ig.ini file, not the ig.json, the ig.ini file, which you see right up here, this ig.ini file, which is the very simple one. So it determines the root folder, and then from there it checks for the other folders. And it does this after it's read the ig.json file. So it reads the ig.json file. It finds the parameters. One of them says, I'm adding this folder. So it lists that folder in the output here, along with the other folders. Okay. So that's that. Okay, so let's go back and now talk a little bit about adding the code system. So first, I want to show how to tell the ig.json file that the implementation guide, your implementation guide, is supposed to include this code system that you are going to create. It's a single file. So you'll create that code system in a file, but you also have to tell the IG publisher through the ig.json file that this code system you want it included. The publisher by default scans these folders that I showed and discovers things. Whatever's in there, it will be included in the published IG by default. But I'll show how to add a parameter to not include things that are not explicitly mentioned in the ig.json file. So I'll add that parameter first, and then we'll specify in the ig.json file that there is a code system. We'll put the information needed, and then the IG publisher is going to go and try to find it in those folders, but it's not created yet, so it's going to give us an error. But there is useful information in that error to understand how the publisher searches for these things. Okay, so the first thing I want you to do is to remember that there is a page that documents what a implementation guide resource is. Okay, and the part we're going to work with, which you might want to read a little bit before you continue the video, you could pause it. We're going to work with this resource entry right here and the subfields under it. Okay, if you remember last time when we did the setup, the resource field, which you see right here, line 14, it's an array and they're left it empty because the publisher works even if though you don't have any resources included in your publisher. Sorry, resources included in your implementation guide. So we're going to work through this, creating some content for this field. Before doing that, I want to tell the publisher, and I'm going to go back one slide, to not automatically search and discover what is in the various folders. Okay. So that is the auto load resources parameter. This column means you cannot repeat that parameter in the JSON file. You could only mention it once. And it's either a true or false, and by default, it is false. So that, I don't believe that's right. I think by default, it will find things. We'll find out. So I went ahead and added this other parameter, auto load resources false. And this squiggly line underneath here, it's the JSON schema warning saying that this is not valid because the specification doesn't have this parameter. This is an implementation parameter. You could ignore this. The other parameter here is a specification parameter, so it's not flagged as an issue. Once we have the file for the code system, we'll come back and check to see what happens if you turn this to true, and whether or not it gets built and whether or not it shows up in the published static site. Okay, so what I want to show here is how to use this resource field, which is in the IG JSON file, to point the IG at a resource that you want to include in the IG. So first notice, resources can be many, so you could have multiple entries for it. For each resource you want to include, you create a resource entry. In JSON, it's an array of objects. The the one we're going to use is the reference field within the resource entry. And the reference field has a data type called reference with a capital R, okay? And you could refer to anything, but in this first example, I'm going to refer to the code system, okay? Now, I'm going to go to this data type because there's important information to understand how to create a reference to this code system that we are creating. So I'm going to click on the reference link with capital R. It's going to take me to the data type section that's documenting this. So click on that. This is a data type, but it has a dedicated page because it's sort of a special data type. Okay? And the way you know it's a data type is because the reference type is a child of element. Things that are a child of element or a kind of it has element in its parent and its ancestors are data types. The things that have resource as the parent or grandparent are resources. Okay, so this is the reference data type. Take the time to read this whole page if you can, but I'm going to just look at the reference field within the reference type, because this is where the information that you need to know about is described. So this section here documents the reference field for the reference type. The part that matters here is when you create your reference, usually for things that are within your IG, you do that with a relative URL. And the relative URL or URI has this pattern. You say the type, which in our case is code system, and then the ID, which is the value you put in the ID field in the code system. This is what you tell the ig.json file to. So then the publisher will take the type and the ID and will go search in the directories for a file of that type and that ID. And the publisher also uses the type and the ID that you specify here to look for files that follow a certain naming pattern. It looks for files that have the type information and the ID, or just the ID and so forth. And we're going to look at that because we're going to specify something, but not actually create the file, and we'll get the error message telling us what it tried, and we'll learn from that. Okay, so I'm pausing and unpausing here to get ready, and I really can't remember what I said before I paused here, but I think we said we're going to go ahead and create the reference to the code system that we're going to create. So I went ahead and did that, and let me show you what that looks like. And before I do that, if you remember, we need to do the type and ID. So that's what you're seeing here. So the resource field before was an empty array, okay? And if you have JSON schema support, if you remember, in the resource field, we have a reference field. So if I hit control, sorry, I have to create the object first, which is the reference, okay? And in the reference object, we have a reference field. And in here, we are going to say code system, which is the type of the resource, slash, and I'm going to create the ID name like this. CS stands for code system, just to qualify the ID that is the code system, and dash KS for the karyotypic sex. Okay, so I know this looks redundant, but if you, I'm going to go back and follow this. So you have the definition has resource, multiple resources. This is one entry of a resource. It has a reference field. The reference field is to a data type of type reference with capital R, and that data type itself has a reference field in it. Okay, so if we quickly look at that again, just so you see it clearly. So we have the resource field right here. Okay, and that's the one you see right here, resource right here. Inside it, there is a reference field, and you see that here, resource, and you're making a reference to a resource. Okay. There are other fields to describe your resource, but right now we're just pointing to a resource. This reference, which is your pointer to the resource, is of type reference, so capital R. So click there. Inside the reference type, there's a reference field, and that's where you put your string, and that's sort of what we did here. Resource, reference, reference, string. Okay. And we could format this a little bit nicer. Okay, so it looks like that. And if you are adding another resource to your IG, you would put a comma here, and you would open another entry for the next one, and you will repeat. You'll do your reference, and then you'll do your reference again, and then you'll put your string. Okay, so this is how you add resources to your implementation guide JSON file. Okay, so now, and remember, I did not create this CodeSystem file yet. So we're just pointing to something that doesn't exist. And now when you run the publisher, okay, and remember the publisher, the way you run it is simply just a Java dev, just like that. I don't want to keep repeating this and waste your time. Okay, so it does its initialization. It has a set of directories in mind to look for things, but eventually it fails. Okay, there's a stack dump right here and the same message here. So it says loading reference CodeSystem /cs-ks. That's the one we added to the JSON file. And saying unable to find it, I copied this text and broke it down here just so we could look at it a little bit easier. Okay, so this is the error message. It says failed, publishing content failed, unable to find the source file for CodeSystem CS. Not specified. I think that's for the version, I think. So tried. So this is where it's useful to know what the publisher tries to find a file that has the code system with that ID. So it looks for file naming patterns like this. So CodeSystem dash the ID .xml in case you're using XML. It flips it around. It puts the ID .type .xml. It puts, and then it does the JSON version of this. Okay, so it does CodeSystem-cs.json, and then it starts to look by subdirectory. So it will look for a CodeSystem directory, and inside it maybe there's a file with just the ID, and a CodeSystem with just ID. And then after it tries these fuller, more qualified names, possibly in nested directories, then it starts looking just by the ID itself. Is there an XML file with that ID? Is there a JSON file with that ID? And it also tries lowercase variants of these names in case your operating system is case sensitive, the file system. And it tells you which directories it looked in. It looked in the under IG root input directory, so it looked at that one, the bare input directory, and it looked in the resources directory inside the input directory. Okay, and if you remember, I mentioned that the IG assumes several directories, all this that you see here, as source directories. But so if those directories existed, it will look through them. But if you remember in our setup so far, under input, we have the input directory, and we only have the resources directory. So that's why it only looked in the resources directory and the input directory. The includes directory is not looked at. That is actually the IG publisher is not aware of that. This is more of a folder for the templating scripts, and we'll get to that at some point. So even though this is an input, it's not input for the IG publisher. It's for the tool, for the templating tooling, which the IG publisher invokes eventually. Okay, so so these are the naming conventions that this tool uses. But not, I'm not sure about what other tools might use in terms of patterns. But in general, you want to use the single name that starts with the type and then dash and then the identifier, because that's what the IG actually ends up publishing, and we'll see that once that happens. So this is this is the file name that I will be creating is the JSON version of, so this is the file we're going to create. Okay, so you could copy that. And I'm going to add the directory that I said we will create for this, and I believe I named it observation.ks. Okay, so that directory the IG publisher is already aware of because we configured that as a parameter, if you remember. Okay, so now I have that file with that name pattern. There's nothing in it. Okay, so this is not a valid code system, obviously, even if I kind of create it as a JSON object. Okay, but we have the directory, the custom one, and we have the file. And now if I run the publisher and I'm going to run it, I'll pause here and run it again and show you the next error that's going to happen. Okay, so the next error, this will fail again, obviously, because the code system file has nothing useful in it. And this is the same error. So it's loading. It's now the error is unable to parse, and it's pointing to the file, the empty file we created. But at least we know that the publisher now found that file. Now we just need to work in that file to actually create our code system. Okay, so let's look back at step 4, where we're creating our code system. We did the first 2 steps here. Now we need to understand what a code system is, so we could fill in that JSON file for it. Okay, so if you follow this link, you'll get to the code system resource, and you could also reach it from the home. If you're at the home page for the FHIR specification, code system is right here under terminology. Okay, so this is the data structure for a code system. The first row, I think I mentioned this maybe in an earlier video, it has all inherited fields from any parent type. So the parent type here is domain resource. It has some fields, and domain resource has a parent resource. So if I click on a domain resource, parent is resource. Each of these have fields. So this one has 4 fields. The resource with capital R type, the subtype, domain resource has its own fields, and it inherits the ones from resource. And the code system inherits all of that. So you could see all that here. Okay. So the ID field is inherited from the parents. And then starting with the URL, these are fields specific to the code system. So we're going to fill in the absolutely necessary fields to get the tooling working. So it's a valid code system JSON file. But we will not initially add the specific concepts for that query to BigSex. I just want to get the tool working so you could see how it looks in the published site. Okay, so I'm going to switch to the code system JSON file, the empty one that I had. And if you remember with the JSON schema support, you first want to specify your resource type so you get the schema support in your editor. So this is a code system. Okay. The next thing to put in, the next good one to put in is an ID. Okay. And this is just an ID. But remember in the IG.json file, which is here, I said that cs-cs is the ID. So that's what you put in the ID here. You just simply put this. Oh, sorry, that's the wrong one. Okay, just like that. Okay. Now, if we come back to the specification documentation, okay, and look through the cardinality, anything that has a minimum cardinality of 1 is probably required. The tools will probably fail if you don't give it. So a URL is needed. So we'll talk about that in a second. But let's go ahead and put a status. A status is a draft one. Okay, so I'm going to go and put status and draft. See, this is the schema support because these are defined in the schema. And a next one that has a minimum cardinality of 1, there is a content field. And content is one of these values. In this example, it's going to be a complete code system. It has all the codes in it. There are other types of code systems. There are fragments or supplements, examples, so forth. So I'm going to put the content now. Okay. And it's complete. Okay. And coming back to the documentation, this is minimum 1, but it's under filter. Filter is optional, so you don't need to actually create a filter, so you don't really need to create a code. And that's about it. But let's talk about the URL. URL is actually an important field in everything we're going to do. So it's worth talking about it a little bit. Okay, so let's see. How should I go about this? The URL, let's look at the data type first. URL here is a URI type. Okay, so I'm going to click on that just to see what that is. It took us to the data type page with URI. This is the data type right here, and you could read about it, what is acceptable in that URI. But if you scroll up a little bit to the top of the page, and you look, these are all the data types here, and you look, yeah, URI is right here. URL is a subtype of URI, and URI is an element. Okay, so it's not really technically a string, but it's sort of like you'll enter it as a string in JSON, but it has the URI requirements. Okay, so that's one aspect of filling in this field. There is this thing called canonical identifier, okay, canonical URI. So that's an important concept to understand. So I'm going to talk about it now because I have not had dedicated videos for this yet. So I'm going to click on the field first to go to the field documentation for CodeSystem, okay? And it tells you it has to be an absolute URI and so forth. So take your time to read this. But the important thing to sort of keep in mind is that this URI, you do usually want it resolvable online. So a tool that comes across this URI should be able to make a HTTP request and retrieve that file. Now, whether you retrieve it with a simple GET request for that URL versus querying a FHIR API to find the resource that has that URL, these are two different things. So you could query, find it, and then retrieve it. But if you just want a simple GET request, the URL that you enter has to work for a FHIR API. And the way the API is designed, you have your API endpoint, which has a URL prefix. And let me... So you have your website, let's say, I don't know, example.com/blah, blah, blah, blah. At some point, you get to the root of your FHIR API. So whatever it is, slash is the start of your API. Usually it's /FHIR and then slash. And then from there, the pattern usually is the type, the resource type. So in this case, it will be /FHIR/CodeSystem/ the ID of the code system that you are looking for. So it's the type / the ID. And because the ID is part of the lookup through the API, it's a good habit to try to use this URL that you have as the URL in this field. So because then the URL in this field will match the actual HTTP GET request to that FHIR API, which will also retrieve the resource. Okay, and it's not an absolute requirement, but it's a good pattern to follow if you're actually publishing these things through a FHIR server. So what does that mean? So that means that this URL field, which we're going to add next, and this is not going to be a real published URL, but we could say www.example, and actually I specified a URL prefix in the IGJSON and probably should use that. So just like I did that, okay, I'm going to copy that. I know it's a little bit lengthy here, unnecessarily lengthy, but I'm going to do that anyway. So URL field prefix slash, so this is a code system, slash cs dash ks. So this is the type, and this is the ID. Okay, code system is cs, ks is csks. Okay, so this should be good. So let me, I'm going to pause here and run this and see what happens and come back. Okay, so this actually worked. I have not tried before to run the publisher on an empty code system, so I assumed it's going to fail, but it actually worked. And this is the minimum stuff you need to get the tooling to work. So let's look at what happened. I ran the publisher the usual way, and let me get a let me get my file browser here as a second to open the published, the generated site. Okay. And sorry, like I said before, I don't edit these videos, so you'll just have to bear with me a little bit here while I am being inefficient. Okay, so let me switch here. Okay, so what you're seeing here, this is the output folder under the IG root. This is the input folder. This is where have our code system file right here, and have our IG.json right here. Okay, so the output folder, and if you remember, I did not create an index file yet, so we're just going to use the table of contents file. This is the table content HTML file. I'm going to open it over here, and let me switch there. Okay, so this is a table of content, and there is an entry right here. And if you hover over it and you're looking at the look at the bottom of the window there, you'll see it's a pointer to the code system entry. If I click on that, this is the code system. So that's the URL I gave it right here. The version, it gave it a version by default, and I think this version inherits from the IG.json version if you don't specify one. Status is a draft. That's the field we filled in. Content is complete. And here is the JSON and XML and Turtle representation of this code system. So this is the same JSON, but after it's been built. So if I click on this, it probably is going to look a little bit richer. So I click on that, you get this totally friendly version of it. Okay, but if you want the raw JSON, you click here, or you could click on download and you get download. I'm going to click on the raw JSON. So this is very similar to the file we created, which was this file right here. But you'll notice that it added a text entry, which is some narrative content automatically generated. There is a text field that's meant to hold HTML that can be displayed in browsers, and you see the HTML starting right here. The URL, that was my entry. The version got populated by default. The date this was built got put in here, and this is a content field. I set that already. Okay, so have this. This entry obviously here is missing a name. So there are a couple of places where you could specify a name. Okay, so this is a code system. There's a name and there's a title here. And let me go ahead and fill these both. And remember, the name is computer friendly, title is human friendly. So computer friendly, bottom line comes to just no really odd characters and no spaces. Assume that this name will be turned into a class or something in some programming language. So make it very straightforward. I don't think adding a name and a title is going to make this entry work, and I'll show you what to do next. But let's just go ahead and do that and see what happens. So let me go back to here and use the autocomplete to do the name, and I'm going to call it a CSKS like that. And we need the comma here. And then let's just give it a title and CSKS. Okay, let's make it stereotypic text CodeSystem. Okay. And I'm going to pause and build this, and then we'll look at the updated site. Okay, so that actually did help. So the title that I put in the CodeSystem JSON file actually got populated here. I've noticed sometimes this doesn't work for certain types of resources, and then you'll have to add the name in the ig.json file, and we'll probably run into that, and I'll show how that works. Okay, so now this is your artifact summary for your implementation guide. So far, I only have one thing, just the CodeSystem. That's the only piece we built so far. And if you go to it, now it has the full title, and it has the name got entered here too, and the title got entered here. And if you look at the JSON for it, you'll see now it has the title right here, and where did the name is right there. Okay, it orders things a little bit differently based on, I think, the natural order according to the code, generated code. In JSON, these fields don't have an order, but if you're using XML format to define things, there is an order. And the order is what you see in these tables. So if you're doing this in XML and you don't have proper XML XSD support in your editor, you have to be careful about defining these fields in this order. ID comes first, and then any of these other ones if you're putting it. So this is the text field that got populated automatically by the narrative generator that is part of the tooling. But you'll have to maintain this order in your, assume this is XML file. This order that you see here is not correct. If this was XML, it has to be, it has to follow what you see here. If you don't, you'll get an error message, and it might be a little bit hard to understand, but it's about the order that you specify. Okay, so let's see, where are we now? So, okay. Because so now we're at the last piece. Now the IG publisher is working, and now just have to add some content. So the content, if you remember, I showed that this is going to be the content. Okay, the ordinal column here, I'm going to ignore it for now. This is sort of an implementation detail. So let's take this unknown karyotype. Okay, we're going to make this as a code in our code set. Okay, and there's a description, and I'll come back to that. So the way you enter a code, which is a concept in a code system, is called a concept because, and maybe I should take a minute here to explain what is the purpose of a code system. A code system is like a dictionary. And you could have many code systems in your IG, and you could reuse other people's code systems. Think of them as a dictionary where you have entries, and you could say further things about these entries, not just list them. So by default, you could have a concept that has a child concept. So you see the concept field. Once you enter a concept, you could enter a child concept from it. So you could have a tree of concepts where you have a very general concept on top and then a more specific one under it. That's not the only relationship you could define between your concepts, but this is the one you get kind of easily by just putting entering your concepts under each other in this structure. But you could also relate concepts to each other in addition to this hierarchy by using what's called properties. And I'm not going to talk about that now, but you basically, once you create your entries for the concepts, you could go on each concept and relate it to other ones by a named property that you, whatever it is you want. Like you want to say this thing is a part of this thing happens before that thing, or this process applies to these other things, and so forth. So you could define your dictionary knowledge in the code system, but before you could define the things, you have to have a concept code, the identifier, the word, the literal value that people would then use in their data. But your knowledge, your information is in the code system. Okay, so now that's what a code system is. So I'm going to enter a concept for that unknown unknown karyotype. So I'm going to assume this is the identifier of the concept. This is the literal value that people will use in their data. And I'm going to create a concept entry for that. So the code field will hold that unknown, keep forgetting it, unknown karyotype value. Okay, so that will go in the code field. The display is the friendly, readable text for the code. For this specific example, the code itself is self-explanatory, so I'm going to use that in the display also. And notice the display is not required, but I'm going to go ahead and fill it in. The code itself is required, so at the minimum, you have to have a code. And a definition, I'll copy the string definition that is in here. So I'll copy this string right here and put it in there, okay? And there are no properties that we're going to say about it. We could put that ordinal property, actually. Let me show you how to do that, actually. It doesn't hurt to do that because it's actually part of the information. Okay, but let's get the concept set up first. Okay, so let me switch you back to, okay, so here, concept, and you see I get an array because you could have multiple concepts. Let me show you. So concept is 0 to many. They could have a flat list of concepts, but if you want to also capture that a concept is a child of another concept, you would nest your concepts. You won't keep them in that flat array. Okay, let me come back here. So this is an array. I'm going to create my first entry, and it's going to be the code. Sorry, that autocomplete went bad. So it's the code, and I'm going to paste that value, comma, and now it was the display, I believe. Yeah, display. I'm going to enter that display, and then there was a definition, and I'm going to go and copy the text from the definition. Okay, and bring that right here, and let me format this file. Okay, and let me put a comma here. There you go. So now this CodeSystem file has one concept in it. Okay. And what you would do is you'll put a comma, and you start your next object, and you do your next concept, and we'll end up doing all of these that way. And I'll do that later. But while we're here, let me go ahead and show you this, how to capture this information also. So think of this as a property. The order of this concept in this data model is 0, because in the messaging implementation for this data model, the numbers are exchanged as a way to represent this. So there are two ways to go about this. I could actually use this 0 as the code. So I could take this and make the code 0 here. Okay, and that would I think be appropriate translation of this information. The code is 0 and the display is this. So that's one way of doing it. So I could do that, but the other thing I want to show you here quickly is the idea of a property. Okay, so what is a property? A property is something more you need to capture about the concepts in your code system. So you define your properties first, and then you could add an entry, a property entry on a concept. So a property, again, is 0 to many. You have to have a code, and you have to have a URI, a formal identifier for the property. We'll make up something. I don't think it's needed. The description and the type is needed. Okay, the type of the value that this property will hold. So let's go ahead and try to kind of make up this property just so you understand how this works. So it's an array, so I'm going to create an object. Okay, so the code for this property, and I'm going to try to borrow as much as possible from the data model I'm using. So the property here is, call it ordinal. Okay, so we'll just capture it as is. You could make it lower case if you want. And then the description, I'm going to make up a description, the order of the value in the enumeration. This is the definition of the property. Okay. And if we come back and let's see what else do we want to say. The URI, I think I'm going to skip it. I think I can get away with that. The type, we need that. Okay, so the type, in this case, it's a number. Okay, and it's an integer. Okay, so now we have a property, coded ordinal. So now I could come on the code itself, on this code, and enter properties. Okay, it's an array, so it could do many. And the code, which means which property are we using, and we're using the ordinal property. And then the value, okay, I don't want to talk about this right now, but usually, not usually, always in FHIR, there is this idea of a field name, generic field name called value, and you attach the type to the name of the field. So in this case, we want to hold a value, and we need to pick the value integer, because that is the type that we decided for the property. So this is the name of the field that holds integers. And the value it got filled in was 0. So that's the 0 is ordinal for this concept. Okay, so it looks like that. And let me briefly talk about this, because this is actually an important thing that will keep coming up. And let me show you the documentation here. So we created, I defined a property. I called it ordinal. I skipped the URI. I gave a description, and the type, I said it's a string. Sorry, it's an integer right here, because these are the allowed types. Now, if you notice, these words here to specify the type of the property are more or less the same words that are attached to the value. So there's this idea of value x, and x means you still need to complete the field name. You complete it by the type that this value field will hold, and you'll have that field names to choose based on the actual type. So since I said integer up here, we'll have to use a field name called value integer and put in the integer value. Okay, so that's what I did here. I have the property, the name of the property, the type of it, and then I created an instance of that property on the concept, and in the value integer field, put 0. Okay, so now this holds one concept from our source model. Okay, it's the same for the rest, so I don't have to kind of walk through this live here. But I'm going to pause. I'm going to build this IG now that I have one concept in it, so you could see how it shows up on the published site. Okay, so I ran the IG publisher. It went fine. It gave me an extra warning. We'll look at the QA report to see how that shows up there. What you see here, this is the CodeSystem page for Karyotypic 6. So this is before we added that concept. I'm going to refresh this page and you'll see the new page. Before we get there, let's finish reading through a couple of lines here. So it says, this code system is referenced in the logical definition of the following value sets. And if you remember in an earlier video, I said we need the code system to define our value sets. So in your IG, as you start defining value sets that use code systems, those value sets will be listed here. But because this one is not used yet, it's saying this code system is not used here, but it may be used elsewhere in other implementation guides. Other users might use your code system. And then there is this line, this code system defines the following codes, and then it's empty. So there's a hint of a table here, but there's nothing here. So now when I refresh, we'll at least see our one concept in here. Okay, so there's a table for the properties, and then we have one property and its description, and then have one entry for the code. And if you remember, I changed the code itself to also be 0 instead of the actual value here. And then I also captured the 0 as a property. So that's why you see here code 0 instead of this initial string that I had. And then the definition, untyped or inclusive period type. The actual property is not shown in this table, the property on this specific concept. Now, if to look at the JSON for this and go to the raw JSON, you'll see more or less the same thing. There's nothing really new here. This narrative, under this text field, which is the narrative, which is usually HTML, and you can see here it's marked as generated. The tooling generated it, and it created this structure here, and the content of this div field, which is under text, is meant to be usable for human use. Okay, the XML version of a code system, just in case you're curious about it, like you could author the code system in XML and it would look like this. It's very similar. So you have an ID, the text field, the URL version, property, concept, and so forth. The difference here is that you have tags that hold fields, and you have this attribute, this idea of an attribute. I don't want to go into the XML format, but there's an ID. Values are usually held in an attribute. So you could then have a nested tag underneath it. The value is an attribute usually called value later. So I think that does it for this video. This video is already too long. I'll add a couple more concepts, and then the next video will look at finding a value set based on this code system. That will go much faster. And we'll learn hopefully some new publisher-related things along the way. Okay, so I'll see you in the next video. Please like and subscribe if you find these videos useful. It will encourage me to keep going, and leave a comment. Let me know what you're interested in next, and if there's anything I could do to improve the content or the quality of these videos. Also, at some point, check out some of these resources listed here. They're still work in progress, and I will have a follow-up video to describe them. Keep in mind that this content is for educational purposes. There are no guarantees of accuracy and completeness, and you should use at your own risk. You might be seeing a few YouTube cards on the screen. They are suggested next videos or related playlists.